Do you remember when the US Navy dominated the Pacific like a modern empire? When its $12 billion aircraft carriers sailed wherever they wanted without anyone daring to challenge them? That era has ended definitively, and it did not end with an epic battle. There were no spectacular explosions, no declarations of war. It ended with something much more dangerous, a strategic trap so perfectly executed that the most powerful navy in history lost control of the Western Pacific without firing a single shot. Military strategists call it the submarine wall. We call it the most significant geopolitical shift since the fall of the Soviet Union. But a fundamental part of this story was never told publicly. If you think you understand how naval power works in the 21st century, stay until the end. There are no sensationalist headlines here. There is verifiable strategic analysis. When China began building artificial islands in the South China Sea in 2013, Western analysts laughed. They labeled it cheap political theater, a primitive bargaining tactic. They were completely wrong. They were not watching political posturing. They were witnessing grand strategy in its purest and most dangerous form. China was not capturing small islands out of national pride. It was building a multi-layered defensive perimeter designed to achieve absolute regional hegemony in the Western Pacific. The same kind of dominance that the United States has enjoyed in the Western Hemisphere since the Monroe Doctrine. For 70 years, the U.S. Navy dominated the Western Pacific like a modern maritime empire. $12 billion aircraft carriers sailed freely. No nation dared to challenge U.S. naval supremacy. The numbers were overwhelming. An aircraft carrier carries 5,000 sailors. It takes 15 years to build. Training the crew takes another decade. It represents the most complex and expensive military system ever created. But here is the math that terrifies U.S. naval planners. A modern submarine with anti-ship missiles costs $500 million. It is built in about 3 or 4 years. A single submarine with a well-aimed torpedo can send that $14 billion carrier to the bottom of the Pacific, along with 5,000 sailors. This is the asymmetric advantage that China exploited brilliantly. A geopolitical scandal is sometimes kept out of the headlines not for lack of documentary evidence, but because the implications are too disturbing for foreign policy establishments to acknowledge publicly. But this particular file fundamentally changes everything we thought we understood about the current balance of military power in the Pacific. Western observers, including specialized analysts inside defense departments, focused obsessively on the most visible and obvious aspects of China's strategy: land reclamation, dredging ships working 24 hours a day, heavy construction equipment operating in disputed waters. They completely missed the deeper and more sophisticated strategic logic operating at the same time. China was systematically creating what is operationally equivalent to a series of permanent unsinkable aircraft carriers strategically distributed across some of the most vital and strategically important sea lanes on Earth. Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, names that meant absolutely nothing to most U.S. citizens, but that represented possibly the boldest, most ambitious, and consequential territorial expansion since the conquests of World War II. Each artificial island built serves multiple military functions that multiply its strategic value exponentially. They dramatically extend Chinese radar coverage deep into the South China Sea. They provide permanent forward bases for sustained air operations. They host long-range anti-ship missile batteries that create interlocking, overlapping lethal engagement zones. But here is precisely what most observers, including professional military analysts, completely miss when they analyze China's strategy. The artificial islands are only the most visible and superficial layer of the integrated defensive system that China has built. Now comes the analysis that completely changes the strategic equation. The real innovation, the real genius, and the real threat of Beijing's strategy lies entirely beneath the ocean's waves, where U.S. reconnaissance satellites cannot detect activity, and where U.S. military power cannot easily or effectively reach. China dramatically expanded its submarine fleet with a focus that reveals what it is preparing for. It concentrated on quiet diesel-electric submarines and sophisticated nuclear attack submarines. The Type 039 Yuan class and Type 093 Shang class submarines represent technological leaps in Chinese capabilities. These are not the noisy, easily detectable submarines that China operated in the 1990s. These vessels incorporate advanced sonar, air-independent propulsion that allows them to remain submerged for weeks, and torpedoes with cruise missiles that can take out an aircraft carrier from 50 miles away. The geography of the South China Sea, with thousands of islands, reefs, and variable depths, provides perfect hiding spots for submarines. China turned these features into an underwater sanctuary. By 2023, China operated more than 70 submarines, with plans to expand beyond 100 by 2030. Quality improved as much as quantity. Earlier submarines were noisy and easily tracked. The new generation achieves noise levels comparable to Russian submarines and approaches U.S. models. That makes them lethal threats to surface vessels. But the submarine fleet represents only one layer of China's anti-access system. The third component involves land-based ballistic missiles capable of hitting ships at ranges that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship missiles earned the nickname carrier killers among Western analysts who immediately understood their significance. These missiles arc high into space, then plunge down at hypersonic speeds, making them extraordinarily difficult to intercept. They can hit moving ships at ranges of over 1,000 miles from Chinese territory. Combined with the submarine threat and air defenses on artificial islands, they create overlapping lethal zones that cover the entire South China Sea. What made this strategy so clever was its defensive character. Beijing could argue that it was defending legitimate territorial claims and ensuring its national security. From China's point of view, the United States is the aggressive party. U.S. aircraft carriers operate thousands of miles from San Francisco, sailing in waters adjacent to Chinese territory. Consider how Washington would react if Chinese carriers were patrolling the Gulf of Mexico. Does this confrontation feel historically familiar to you? Why did China choose submarines over aircraft carriers? Washington underestimated this threat, or deliberately downplayed it, because the notion that a $500 million submarine can neutralize a $14 billion aircraft carrier changes everything. This asymmetric advantage rewrites the rules of naval power. Taiwan sits at the center of this strategy, or its justification. Does the United States have an effective military response? Here we arrive at the security dilemma that explains why this situation is so dangerous. Every step China takes to improve its security makes the United States less secure. Every U.S. response makes China feel more threatened. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle that becomes nearly impossible to escape. We have seen this before. In the early 20th century, German naval expansion triggered British fears over maritime trade routes. Britain responded by building more battleships. Germany built even more. Both sides locked themselves into an arms race that contributed to World War I. No one truly wanted that war. Structural forces overwhelmed rational decision-making. Taiwan is at the absolute geographic center of this dynamic, because Taiwan represents the critical geopolitical link in what military strategists call the first island chain. This chain of natural islands stretching from southern Japan through Taiwan to northern Philippines forms a natural geographic barrier. If that barrier remains under U.S. or pro-U.S. control, Chinese naval forces remain effectively bottled up in their immediate coastal waters, unable to project significant military power into the wider Pacific. If that barrier is broken, particularly at the Taiwanese link, which is the most vulnerable point, China gains strategic access to deep ocean waters and the operational capacity to challenge U.S. power directly across the entire Pacific basin. This is precisely where China's submarine wall strategy produces its most dangerous and destabilizing geopolitical consequence. By creating operational conditions in which the United States cannot easily or safely project naval power near the Chinese mainland, Beijing has systematically reduced the credibility of U.S. security guarantees to Taiwan. Think carefully about this military situation. If U.S. aircraft carriers cannot operate safely in the Taiwan Strait without facing genuine risks of catastrophic loss, how exactly does the United States fulfill its defense commitments to the island? This is not a rhetorical or academic question. U.S. military planners at the Pentagon ask this operational question every day, and honestly, they do not have a convincing strategic answer. The implications reach far beyond Taiwan. Specifically, U.S. alliance relationships across the entire Indo-Pacific region depend fundamentally on the perceived credibility of U.S. security guarantees. If the United States cannot effectively project power in the Western Pacific because of China's submarine wall, what real value do U.S. security partnerships have for countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, or Australia? This strategic uncertainty forces regional powers into an extraordinarily uncomfortable and unsustainable geopolitical position. They want to maintain U.S. security protection against potential threats, but at the same time, they cannot economically afford to antagonize China, which is their main trading partner. The result is what professional diplomats call strategic hedging. Regional powers carefully maintain formal security ties with America while deliberately preserving and expanding economic relations with China. The economic dimension of China's strategy deserves considerably more analytical attention than purely military analysis in Western media typically provides. The South China Sea contains some of the most economically important commercial shipping routes in the world. Approximately 60% of total global maritime trade passes through these specific waters annually. By establishing effective control over these waters, China gained disproportionate influence over the entire regional economy and, by extension, over significant portions of the global economy. What we have witnessed over the last decade was not simply traditional military expansion. It was the deliberate, systematic construction of a new regional order, with China firmly positioned at its gravitational center. Are you still following this analysis? Have you rejected the oversimplified explanations? In the comments, do you think the United States can realistically maintain its traditional position in the Pacific, or has China effectively already won this competition without firing a single shot? The geopolitical tragedy of this situation lies in its apparent structural inevitability. China, as a rising power, is compelled by the relentless logic of the international system to seek regional hegemony in order to secure its own survival. The United States, as the existing global hegemon, is equally compelled to resist China's efforts to avoid being displaced. Neither side genuinely wants direct war, but both sides are driven by structural imperatives that make conflict increasingly likely in mathematical terms. What China achieved with its submarine wall is remarkable from a purely strategic perspective. In less than 2 decades, Beijing completely transformed a limited coastal defense force focused only on protecting immediate territorial waters into a genuinely regional naval power capable of effectively contesting U.S. dominance across the entire Western Pacific. This transformation proceeded with remarkable consistency across multiple different Chinese administrations. It was meticulously planned decades in advance and executed with impressive strategic discipline. The implications for the global order could not be more profound. The international system built after 1945 rested on the fundamental assumption of undisputed U.S. naval supremacy. China's submarine wall marks the beginning of the end of that era, at least in the Western Pacific. Other nations have watched China's success closely and absorbed its strategic lessons. Russia has applied similar logic in the Baltic. Iran has developed anti-access strategies in the Persian Gulf. The era of U.S. global hegemony without serious challenges is ending, not through direct military defeat, but through the patient construction of regional spheres of influence that systematically limit the reach of U.S. power. The era of undisputed U.S. dominance in the Pacific has definitively ended. A new era of strategic competition has begun, where the rules remain unwritten and the outcomes remain fundamentally undetermined. Close the video. Remember a deliberately forgotten strategy. Question a fundamental geopolitical assumption.